welcome to today's episode of Daily Debrief, your primer to international news brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Swastika and let's begin with our first story. We begin with Iran nuclear deal and the talks around it, which are expected to resume on November 29th. Iran said on Monday that the United States should provide guarantees that it will not abandon the 2015 nuclear deal if the talks succeed. While the US was part of the deal when it was first signed, Donald Trump withdrew from it in 2018 and imposed very heavy sanctions on Iran. Now, these sanctions caused a huge amount of suffering for the people of the country. After Joe Biden was elected, talks began to see if the US could re-enter the deal, but they have been hindered by the fact that it seems to want to impose fresh conditions on Iran. Talks in Vienna finally were paused after the new Iranian president, Ebrahim Raisi, was elected and Iran said it wanted to re-evaluate the progress so far. Now we have with us NewsClick's editor Prabir Purkayastha with us. Now Prabir, in the past you have spoken to us about how US has become treaty incapable. How justified are Iran's demands right now for asking USA to, once they enter the treaty, they should stay in the treaty?
Well, the understanding of any treaty is binding on both sides. So now if one side walks out of a treaty, wants to come back into the treaty with fresh conditions, obviously that this could be a cascading issue because it could walk out again and ask for again fresh conditions. Yeah. This, as you refer to my statement of US being treaty incapable, is also what you have seen, for instance, in climate change. You have one president, Clinton, who signs or agrees to sign a deal on global warming. Next president, George Bush, walks out of it. The US doesn't ratify it. Obama makes certain commitments in Paris, and again, we find Trump walks out of it. The Iran deal has also been of a very similar kind. There were agreements made by which Iran exported out almost all its stock of enriched uranium. It agreed that it will not enrich uranium except very small amounts, which would be used for medicinal purposes. It actually abandoned nuclear reactors it was building. It also dismantled centrifuges or mothballed centrifuges at the time in production of enriched uranium. All this Iran had done. Trump walked out over the deal and said, we want more. You have to also commit that you will never enrich uranium. You also have to discuss your missiles, and we want the missile program also to be stopped, except for very short-range missiles. You will also have to give us more guarantees that you will not intervene in any part of West Asia and let us do what we want. So these are the conditions with which Trump withdrew from the deal. When we see that they are wanting to come back to the deal, it is not unconditionally. They are actually asking for more conditions. So therefore, the Al-Raisi team's position, negotiating team's position, that A, if you come back to the deal, it will have to be unconditional. B, that you cannot walk out of it again. Otherwise, we start the whole game all over again every time a president changes. And this president, as you know, his term finishes in 2024. So at the most, the deal will be about for 2.5 years. So what happens after that is the question the Iranian side is raising.
In fact, what are the fresh terms and concessions that USA is asking out of Iran to re-enter the deal?
That's an interesting question because Trump walked out of the deal virtually asking for the same thing that the Biden administration wants to rediscuss with the Iranian side. So effectively, the blue water between Biden and Trump is not so visible when you see the kind of demands Biden is asking for entering back to the deal. Except for the fact he said, okay, I want to come back to the deal. A number of commentators have said that the simplest thing for Biden would have been to re-enter the deal sans any condition. There should not have been any condition. After all, the US withdrew from a deal which Iran was observing. There was nothing from the Iranian side which was a problem. When Trump withdrew from the deal, his main argument was that Obama was a bad negotiator. We could have got more. And I will show you that we will get more. But it didn't happen. We know that entire Trump presidency, he tried very hard to squeeze Iran. Yes, Iran's oil exports dropped dramatically. Yes, Iranian economy was hit very, very badly. Iran could not import even COVID-19 medicines at that point of time and vaccines. So all of this Iran faced. So after that, for Biden not to unconditionally get back into the deal, but repeat Trump's conditions, except these are the conditions for re-entering the deal, makes this whole thing as if you take one step forward and two steps back every time. This is what Iran and US seem to be doing with the kind of conditions each new president lays down. And as I said, this is not only true about the Iran deal, it's also true about a number of other deals that the US negotiates. In fact, that's why my statement earlier that US is become treaty incapable, because it has become captive to their internal politics. And the domestic politics of the US is fractured so badly that no president will agree to what the other side, Republicans versus Democrats being the division, has negotiated. So in that sense, what is the point? And this is what Iran is raising. What's the point of trying to negotiate a deal which the next president can walk out of? So what is the guarantee that if you come in and we negotiate anything that we want to at this moment, we can still discuss anything, what's the problem? What is the guarantee that the next president will stay with the deal? And I think that's a very legitimate question to ask. It would not have been asked if the US had come back to the deal unconditionally. Unfortunately, the US chose the negotiations. And once you have chosen negotiations over returning unconditionally from a treaty that you yourself withdrew out of, then of course this opens a door for both sides. And let's not forget, this is the United Nations sanctioned treaty. The US Security Council took resolutions on that. The US imposed sanctions on the countries, including Iran, for violating, quote unquote, their sanctions. That means it was not sanctions on Iran alone. Anybody who wanted to buy oil from Iran was also sanctioned. So this is illegal, because United Security Council, once has taken a decision, it's binding on all the countries. So the US has consistently violated international law while supposedly upholding international law. And this abandoning a treaty, wanting to come back to it with new conditions, I think is an example of that.
So now the next meeting is going to take place on the 29th in Vienna. Let's see what are the terms and conditions that are going to get tabled for these negotiations between the two countries. We will keep an eye on that story. And thank you, Prabir, for joining us. Our next story is from Nicaragua, where Daniel Ortega is set to become the president for the fourth time. Ortega is believed to have won around 76% of the vote. He is the leader of the Sandinista movement, which has driven massive social and economic changes that have empowered the people of the country. However, Ortega and the Sandinistas have been the targets of the US and European powers for a long time. While the innumerable observers on the ground said that the elections were free and fair, the US and its allies disputed it. We bring to you the latest on this from our correspondent Zoe.
On Sunday, November 7th, the people of Nicaragua went to the polls to elect their next president and vice president. Over 60% of the population participated in this electoral process, which was observed by hundreds of international observers who were on the ground in places across the country in Nicaragua. This electoral process was met with a lot of pushback from Western countries and U.S. allies. The United States has classified the elections as a sham. It has also said that they do not recognize the results and have called it a fraudulent process. U.S. allies such as the European Union also refused to send electoral observers and has used this electoral process to justify the imposing of further economic measures that both parties have already been imposing on Nicaragua. Just on Friday, ahead of the elections, the U.S. House passed the Renacer bill, which would impose further sanctions on Nicaragua. And following the electoral process on Sunday, Joe Biden released a statement saying that the U.S. calls these elections a sham, that he compared the Ortega government to the dictatorship before the Sandinista revolution, and also saying that the U.S. would use all possible economic measures it could to put maximum pressure on Nicaragua to force them to respect human rights. I think it's important that we understand the context in the region that this takes place in. The U.S. is, of course, increasing its pressure against all of the countries in the region that it considers the axis of evil. Among this, there's Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua. With Venezuela, for example, the recent extradition of Alex Saab to the United States is a clear example of this, a clear example to sabotage the dialogue process that the Venezuelan opposition had been engaging with the government. With Cuba, of course, we see the upcoming protest planned for November 15th as another example of the U.S. trying to push its agenda within Cuba. And now with Nicaragua, we're going to see, of course, an increased campaign of pressure against the country, with the U.S. trying to, force Ortega out of power and use any means necessary to achieve this goal. So it's important that we keep an eye on Nicaragua, understanding the role that it plays geopolitically in forming part of the ALBA TCP platform and, participating in many regional structures that promote Latin American integration and anti-imperialist non-dependence on the United States, and pushing really for this multilateral world that the U.S. is so afraid of. And so in the next coming days, we'll have the official results released. As of now, as I said, 97% of the votes have been counted, and it is giving a clear victory to Daniel Ortega of the Sandinista Front for National Liberation. There were several opposition candidates which the U.S. has failed to recognize, which does make it, of course, among other things, a legitimate process. And so we'll be keeping our eyes on Nicaragua in the coming days, seeing how the U.S. responds. And of course, there were also celebrations reported on Sunday night when there was already the first signs that the Sandinista Liberation Front were going to win this victory. So we've seen the response of the people, which is overwhelmingly supporting the government of Daniel Ortega, which has brought enormous amounts of economic stability, social stability, and political stability to the country in a very fraught region with a lot of high levels of poverty in the surrounding neighboring countries, and high levels of violence. We see Nicaragua as a somewhat exception from this regional trend. So we'll keep our eyes on Nicaragua, keep our eyes on the region, and of course be following all the other pressure campaigns of U.S. imperialism on the region.
Our next story is from COP26 summit in Glasgow. While there has been a lot of discussion on industries and pollution, one of the major causes of global warming is militarism and war. So members of people's movements who are at Glasgow have intensified their demand for an end to militarism, war, and imperialism. We bring some of these voices to you.
Hello, my name is Fiona. I'm the Europe coordinator for BDS campaign, Boycott Divestment Movement, which is a Palestinian-led global anti-racist movement. So we're here today in Glasgow because Palestine is a climate justice issue. Israel is making himself and itself like green, but it's totally greenwashing because they are like using Palestinian natural resources, destroying Palestinian land, violating rights of indigenous Palestinian people. They are extracting gas and natural resources from Palestine, and all of this with the complicity of European governments and the European Union. So we're here today to stop to the greenwashing and to really say that gas, natural gas is a fossil fuel, and we need to really work together, unite our struggle, and be all united for climate justice.
I'm here with a coalition of environmental and peace groups, and we're really calling out the governments for military carbon emissions, which are huge. The Pentagon is the single largest emitter of carbon as an institution in the world. In the UK, there's something like 40 million cars is produced by the UK's military, the same amount of emissions as 40 million cars. So we're talking about a huge carbon footprint, and at the moment it's excluded from many of the reporting that countries give of their emissions. There's no requirement for military to be included. So you've got this huge, what we call an elephant in the room of the military and the carbon footprint being excluded from climate agreements. So we can't actually have progress on climate change unless we start to talk about the military's emissions. And that's part of our call here, is that they should firstly be transparent about the amount of emissions they produce, and secondly, that they should start to reduce the emissions in line with the science, which means reducing also the size of the military. And of course, that's a big issue, because if we start to reduce the military spending, we've actually got some of the money we need for things like a Green New Deal that many people are calling for here. So there's a real opportunity to say that the military can be can only be part of the solution if they are being reduced and the money is being diverted to what we actually need right now, which is protecting our planet and protecting the people.
Hi, I'm Jody Evans. I'm from Code Pink from the United States of America here in Glasgow at COP26. We're just joining the march as the peace and justice contingent because there's no greater contributor to climate change on the planet than militarism, and it's not even being talked about in the blue zone, but it is being talked about here in the streets. We need to end foreign militarism. It is the tool of the empire, it is the tool of the colonizers, it is the tool of capitalism. They could not be destroying the earth if they did not have the military to protect them. We must end war.
And finally, yesterday on November 8th was the 35th birth anniversary of digital rights activist Aaron Schwartz, who died by suicide in 2013. Schwartz is seen as a martyr and a hero by digital rights activists across the world, and his brilliance and commitment continue to remain an inspiration. We have with us Prashant in our studio for the show. Prashant, if you could tell us a little bit more about Aaron Schwartz.
Right, Swastika, like you said, Aaron Schwartz lived a very short but incandescent life, so to speak. And for many of us who worked on many of these issues, who were passionate about these issues, his entire life was an inspiration. Very young genius who, I believe at the age of 16, he was contributing to what is called the RSS, which is a standard by which, say, blogs, blog feeds and all can be obtained. He was actually one of the people who worked on creating Reddit, the world famous site. And he made a lot of money at a very young age through tech and through his brilliance in technology. But from a very young age, he decided that, he wanted to spend his life and he wanted to spend his resources and his fame in order to create, in order to ensure the freedom of people online, in order to create rights for people online, in order to sort of make the world, the online world or the internet, not just the preserve of some small corporations, but of the people as a whole. So, his entire life was spent in building the commons, so to speak. So, for instance, he was a huge contributor to the idea of open access, which basically says that people should have access to research work that is being done, that it should not be locked behind some journals. He wrote something called the Guerrilla Open Access Manifesto, which has a lot of these ideas, which says that knowledge should essentially be free. And knowledge should be shared by people, because research, for instance, that is done across the world is done based on the experiences of people and should not be shut behind gateways or payment gateways where only if you can pay thousands of dollars, you're able to access some of these research. People need it across the world. And many of these lessons actually became all the more relevant in the last year as we discussed COVID-19. So he also worked, for instance, against repealing some of these draconian laws which would have restricted freedom of the internet, like SOPA in the United States. And he was, on the verge of becoming one of those very important people in the technology and social sphere of the United States. He was reading a lot about government. He was very interested in government. He set up a project which helped actually bring out a lot of legal papers, which were actually, again, hidden behind paywalls into the public domain. In 2000, a couple of years before he died, I'll tell you the reason why as well. So he went to Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he was a scholar. He downloaded a lot of journal papers from this journal called JSTOR, and he made it publicly. He planned to make it publicly available. That was the idea. But the United States government and MIT, with the collusion of MIT, went behind him like he had committed some big crime. So his crime was just downloading papers, en masse, and large number of papers. But they tried to portray him as a thief. And they booked him under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is the same act which is also being used against Julian Assange, by the way. They booked him under that act, and he faced the possibility of spending years in prison. Or he had to agree to a compromise which would have taken away all his rights as a citizen, because in the United States they have the system whereby if you're convicted or if you reach an agreement with the prosecutors, you lose your rights to vote or to contest in elections. So facing these kind of challenges, the possibility, he spent a huge amount of money on this fight. He was very young at that point of time. This is 2011, which is 2013, 8 years ago. So he was 27 years old. So at that point of time, he was not even 27 years old. So at that point of time, facing these challenges, he had suffered a lot of mental health issues as well. He tragically committed suicide. So it's a story which chilled people across the world, because here was somebody whose cause was so transparent. It was knowledge. It was not money. He had made his money. He was fighting to expand the boundaries of knowledge. In the days that followed, a lot of people published their work in open access. The open access movement continues to be a very important one this day. And digital rights activists across the world still remember Aaron Schwartz as somebody, who lost his life too young, who was taken, who went too young, and who's even today, despite his very young age, his words, his deeds really continue to inspire a lot of us.
Thank you, Prashant, for telling us about Aaron Schwartz. And keep following us on People Dispatch and come back tomorrow for your dose of Daily Debrief. Thank you.